It's June 13th, 1971, and the New York Times has just published its first of many installations of the Pentagon Papers, a top-secret history of the Vietnam War written by Robert McNamara and secretly given to the papers by Daniel Ellsberg, exposing years of lies, scandal, and betrayal by the highest government officials, most importantly Presidents Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson, forever putting a stain on their administrations. But I wouldn't even be making this presentation now, nor would you be listening to it if it weren't for the brave, seemingly impossible decisions made by New York Times and the Washington Post journalists. So, let's wind it back. Way before the general public was given access to these documents and accompanying classified information. The main character in this scandal is Daniel Ellsberg. He's the man who's responsible for the stealing, copying, and distribution of the documents to news publications. He describes the documents as, quote, "The Pentagon Papers was a long 7,000-page history, 43 volumes of U.S. decision-making in Vietnam from 1945 to 68, unquote. When the U.S. entered the war to back the French's counter-revolutionary effort, the war had already been going on. Many Americans didn't see the point in our role. Nobody expected the war to last years and cost thousands of U.S. troops' lives." Ellsberg was of the growing popular opinion that the United States' presence in Vietnam was unnecessary and a net negative. What Ellsberg took away after seeing the documents was, quote, that Congress and the public should have access to this information and that it had been wrongfully withheld from them, unquote. Ellsberg then felt that it was his responsibility to provide this information to the appropriate parties. He sent it to Congress, and when that went nowhere, he turned it to the newspapers. Now that we know the majority of what all 4,000 documents contains, let's dig deeper into what the ramifications could have been for the United States national security as we knew it. We're going to get inside the mind of the man himself with a question from NPR interviewer.
A lot of other material from your safe at the Rand Corporation about U.S. nuclear war plans. What were you going to do with that material?
I planned to release that as soon as the Pentagon Papers, as they came to be known, had whatever effect they could have on the Vietnam War. The nuclear information, I thought then and now, was actually more important, but the bombs were falling in Vietnam at that time, and I wanted to shorten that war as much as I could.
After the Times got access to the documents through Ellsberg, they published the story of growing U.S. involvement in the war. The Nixon administration went to court to stop the publication of the documents on the grounds that it risked national security. Thanks to Nixon himself, all of the phone calls and conversations in the Oval Office are recorded, which allows us to hear the following reaction of the Times story coming out.
What is your advice on that Times thing, John? You would like to do it?
I would believe so, Mr. President. Otherwise, we will look a little foolish in not following through on our legal obligations. And
has this ever been done before?
Publication like this, or
No. Has the government ever done this to a paper before?
Oh yes, advising of their. Yes, we've done this before.
Have we? All right.
While John Mitchell is correct that the U.S. government often advises and observes newspapers, never before in history has the government sued a newspaper to prevent them from publishing a story. The distinction is significant, especially to the future of free press. Newspapers around the nation, big and small, paid close attention as the landmark case between the New York Times Company and the United States played out. Journalism was on the edge of its seat as it watched whether the constitutional right of free press would be upheld when applied to the classified documents. Namely the Washington Post, which at the time was not a major newspaper as it is today, who had access to portions of the Pentagon Papers. As the world watched the case New York Times versus the United States, Katharine Graham, publisher of the Washington Post, had a big decision to make. It was between her responsibility and devotion to free press and her worry of sending her editors and herself to prison. The following interview in 1997 explains what was going through her mind the night of her big decision.
I had to print that night. And so I had to make up my mind on the phone, and I said to Fritz Beebe at the other house, what would you do? Because I got along with him wonderfully. I loved his judgment. And he said, I guess I would not. Because I can understand that. We were going public. It was very risky. And the administration was threatening us. And I really was convinced by the editors and the reporters that they were right and that we really had to go ahead. And so I really gulped, and I really was not what your heroic leader is. I just said, oh, go ahead.
This decision for Katharine Graham was even harder for her as a woman in the 70s who inherited the company from her late husband. Even though the Washington Post was her father's, when he died, he had given it to her husband. This never caused resentment, but once she became publisher, it caused her to face discrimination and lack of respect by the board members. In the following clip, you will see an interview where she addresses such discrimination.
I would have said 2 or 3 years ago, before the women's issues had arisen so much to the fore as they have now, I would have said then that I never felt discrimination. Obviously, if you're the number one woman in an organization, I mean the number one person in an organization, it's hard to discriminate against you. But there are other situations in which you feel it when you're on an equal basis with men in a committee meeting or something like that, in which you feel they don't have much regard for your view.
The gravity of her decision loomed. In the wake of the Washington Post's bold move to publish the Pentagon Papers, newspapers across the nation swiftly followed suit, amplifying and echoing their message. Despite government restrictions and risking her power within her own company, the Washington Post pressed on, driven by courage and an unwavering commitment to the rights and principles of a free press. To access some insight into the principles and rights these newspapers decided to uphold, Chairman and CEO of the Spokesman Review, Betsy Coles, speaks on the ethics of a newspaper.
There was a lot of internal discussion at the Times about could they be held criminally liable because they were knowingly publishing what was labeled as top secret information, and they balanced that with the public's right to know of, hey, this information is so contrary to what the past 3 presidents have been saying that the public has the right to know what the behind the scenes, what they were really knowing, and that they knew they were going to escalate the war, and they knew it was going to be problematic, and the public had the right to know that.
As someone who grew up in this era around journalists, being an extremely successful one herself for decades, and even getting to know Katharine Graham, Mrs. Coles has exceptional expertise in the rights and responsibilities of a free press. The information distributed by journalists finally shed light on the unnecessary atrocities U.S. veterans and current militants had faced. Rather than being complacent, they chose to act in their responsibility. Their actions not only underscored their bravery, but also safeguarded a fundamental liberty. These narratives unfolded even before the trial reached its conclusion. Just 12 days after the Washington Post's groundbreaking publication, on June 30th, 1971, the Supreme Court rendered its verdict. In a decisive 6-3 ruling in favor of the New York Times, the court affirmed the right to continue publishing. The information revealed to the public by the Washington Post and New York Times circulated around the nation and then the world. The public already wanted the U.S. to back out of the war. Then it was confirmed that the U.S. had been losing for decades, that their husbands, brothers, sons, cousins, and nephews had been sent to their deaths for a cause that the administrations of 5 presidents knew we'd lose. It would be a mistake to assume that the publishing of the Pentagon Papers and the following court case was only relevant in the 70s Vietnam War era. Whilst the precedent was important to the extreme scrutiny of the executive branch during the Watergate scandal,
what did the president know, and when did he first know it?
Let's expand the timeline a little bit. During World War II, the U.S. government directly controlled war-related information through the Office of Censorship. The press cooperated voluntarily under strict guidelines about what could and could not be published, especially anything that might aid the enemy. It wasn't until the precedent was set that the free press was established at last over the government, even in times of war. Rolling forward to the 2000s, in the aftermath of the September 11th attacks, the U.S. government implemented measures to conduct certain immigration hearings in secret, particularly those deemed of special interest to national security. Rabi Haddad, a Lebanese national, was arrested for visa violations, and his hearings were closed to the public and press. In the Detroit Free Press v. Ashcroft 2002, the United States Court of Appeals ruled unanimously 3-0 that the government's blanket policy of closing special interest immigration hearings was unconstitutional. This case underscored the enduring relevance of the New York Times v. United States. After the brave publication of the Pentagon Papers, the war cause did not stand a chance. Finally, January 23, 1973, the U.S. signed an agreement with North Vietnam to end the war. We have the journalists of the Times and Post to thank for their devotion to the responsibility and right of informing the public.
I want it clearly understood that from now on, ever, no reporter from the Washington Post is ever to be in the White House. Is that clear?
Absolutely.